people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook.
Read my lips. No.
American people have voted to make a new beginning.
There is no limit to the greatness of America.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Hi there, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello, and hopefully we're going to find out if John's ready to predict the election outcome yet. I know last week, John, you were of the opinion that it was too close to call. How about now? Is it still too close to call?
Still way too close to call, Chaz. Hillary Clinton is ahead in the earliest polls coming out of Iowa today, but Joe Biden may run, and who knows what Jeb Bush or Chris Christie are going to do.
He's
So,
already
look, it is still
starting
way too
on
early.
2016. John, shut up. Well, while we're waiting, I know 2 weeks ago you were threatening to put my September call of this election for Obama on a loop. Do we have that video to play now, John? Because I'd love to have a look at that again. Very interesting.
Funny, we looked for that this week, and the tape is nowhere to be found.
How
we thought
about
it was in
that?
archives, but it's just not there.
What a shame. I'm really surprised. But while we sort that one out, here's the news.
And heading the news from Planet America this week, Barack Obama has been elected to a second term as President of the United States. And on election night, there were echoes of his first famous call for unity 8 years ago.
We are not as divided as our politics suggest. We're not as cynical as the pundits believe. We are greater than the sum of our individual ambitions, and we remain more than a collection of red states and blue states. We are and forever will be the United States of America. And together, with your help and God's grace, we will continue our journey forward and remind the world just why it is that we live in the greatest nation on earth. Thank you, America. God bless you.
I have just called President Obama to congratulate him on his victory. His supporters and his campaign also deserve congratulations. I wish all of them well, but particularly the President, the First Lady, and their daughters. This is a time of great challenges for America, and I pray that the President will be successful in guiding our nation.
In the end, despite a competitive national popular vote, the President won big in the Electoral College. President Obama won all of the states that he took 4 years ago, except North Carolina and Indiana, for a total this year of 332 Electoral College votes to Governor Romney's 206. The President's victory in Ohio and Virginia sealed the deal, and Florida was icing on the Democrats' cake. All 435 members of the US House of Representatives were also on the ballot this week, and most of them are back for another 2 years as well. The House will stay in Republican hands with a small net gain for the Democrats, coupled with the loss of a few blue dog Conservative Democrats as well.
And if you want one more example of what's wrong with the American electoral system, and I know you do, why not? This is a great example. Since the states can draw their congressional boundaries however they like, state governors often draw the congressional lines to suit their party. This is called gerrymandering, and the result is this. The Democrats actually won almost a million more congressional votes than the Republicans. And yet the Republicans won 239 seats to 196. Dodge factor? Extreme. And good luck trying to convince state governors to give up that power.
All right. Meanwhile, Republican hopes of winning a Senate majority to go with their House majority were dashed this week. And again, it was moderates who were shown the door. The Senate seat in Massachusetts, held for a couple of years by centrist Republican Scott Brown, has been reclaimed by Liberal Democrat Elizabeth Warren.
And given the Republicans were favourites to take a majority in the Senate only 3 months ago, that is a huge turnaround. And I'll show you a graph that may or may not be a massive coincidence, but we won't go quite yet. These are Nate Silver's odds of who would gain the majority in the Senate. But before I show you this graph, I'd like to remind you of the time when Republican Senate candidate and moron Todd Akin said that women don't tend to get pregnant when they're raped legitimately. Now, while bearing those comments in mind, let's go to the laptop. Akin's comments were made at this date here. And look what happened to the Republican Senate majority chances after that. Boop! As I said, it might be a coincidence, but do note that Aiken ended up only winning 39% of the vote in a fairly reddish state. And Richard Murdoch, who also made controversial rape-related comments, won 44% of the votes in Indiana, which is an even more reddish state. And we'll be talking more about that later on.
You waited till after the election to show that you can do sound effects for your graphs? You've been hiding it. All right, also on the state ballot, a number of gubernatorial contests as well, with Republicans gaining one overall to now hold 30 state houses to the Democrats just 18. States also voted on a variety of ballot measures, in California backing a new education tax but against a repeal of the death penalty. Maine and Maryland voted to legalise same-sex marriage. Oregon, Colorado and Washington State voted to legalise marijuana. Montana voted for parental notification of abortions. North Dakota voted for a smoking ban, and Oklahoma voted for a ban on affirmative action.
That now makes 9 states that have legalised gay marriage in America, some by the courts, some by legislation and some by the vote. And the polls are only moving in one direction, so I suspect that debate is drawing to an end. On the other hand, the legalisation of marijuana could become a much bigger issue in America over the next few years. 56% of people support legalisation nationally, and that is growing. But the interesting thing is that Obama's Drug Enforcement Agency has been moving in the opposite direction, tightening the controls on marijuana and actually overruling states that declare it legal with drug raids on those states. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this could become a big issue in the Democrat primary in 2016.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, the confetti was barely settled before it was back to the political wrangle. President Obama, due to speak tomorrow, our time, on the state of the economy and a possible way forward on a debt reduction deal. Republican House Speaker John Boehner is indicating there may be some room for compromise, but certainly not on the question of higher taxes.
Now, the President has signalled a willingness to do tax reform with lower rates. Republicans have signalled a willingness to accept new revenue if it comes from growth and reform. So let's start the discussion there.
Look, we're going to be talking a lot more about this issue over the next few weeks. Probably we'll only be talking about this, but let me just say one thing. If we know one thing about this Congress, we know they're going to make this go down to the last week. So disregard everything anyone says until then, especially me.
Deal. Also making news this week, former Arizona Congresswoman Gabby Giffords came face to face with convicted murderer Jared Lee Loughner for the first time since he shot her in the head in January last year. Loughner killed 6 people and wounded 12 others, including Giffords, at a community cabinet event. He's been sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms this week after a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Gabby Giffords did not recontest her House seat at this week's election, which in a tight race now seems to have been claimed by Republican Gulf War veteran Martha McSally. And finally, just days after the 2012 presidential election, and there's already an early indication of the likely presidential field in 2016. A poll today by the Democratic polling firm PPP has given outgoing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton a massive lead in first-to-vote Iowa, the state that Clinton crucially lost to Barack Obama 4 years ago on his road to the White House. In the race to be the next Democratic presidential nominee in 4 years, Secretary Clinton leads Vice President Joe Biden by more than 40 percentage points, with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and Massachusetts Senator-elect Elizabeth Warren behind them. The other potential names being bandied about this week include Martin O'Malley of the state of Maryland, Deval Patrick of Massachusetts, and they're all getting less than 1% each. And so, Chaz, it begins.
No, John, so you begin. What a surprise. A whole bunch of names no one's heard of, polled badly. 2016 is a long way away, John, and I remind you of the Rick Perry sticker that you put on your laptop earlier this year, John. Besides, the real question is, how's Malia Obama polling for 2028? Tell me that.
A little bit of weakness in New Hampshire at this early stage.
Okay. I loved about that breaker?
What's that?
It wasn't even slightly annoying.
No, not at all. That's great music. I love it. Now we know Barack Obama has won a second presidential term, but let's find out how he actually did it and why a lot of the polls largely missed the strength of his position in those final weeks. Sean Trendy is the senior election analyst at Real Clear Politics and an editor of the next Almanac of American Politics. Sean, we're expecting a nail-biter, a cliffhanger. This was going to come down to hanging chads and Supreme Court challenges. In the end, it was something of a blowout, if not a landslide. What happened?
Well, thank goodness it wasn't. I don't think my nerves could have stood another couple of weeks of this. But, you know, it actually was a fairly close race, 2 percentage points. The Electoral College made it look a little broader, which is actually one of the things the Electoral College is generally intended to do. But it wasn't a blowout. It was a 2-point race. Republicans lost a few Senate seats and a few House seats, but otherwise it was a status quo election.
A status quo election, but surprisingly strong showings from Barack Obama in some of those crucial states. Florida going to Obama, certainly a surprise. What do you put that down to? Were the pollsters missing the X factor that was the Obama ground game?
Yeah, you know, I think part of it might have been the ground game, and part of it was we saw in the last week in the national polls a pretty substantial swing, about 3 points towards Obama. I think state polls aren't polled as frequently, and I just think they didn't have a chance to catch up. We had seen some movement. We just weren't sure that it was, quote-unquote, real. But now we know it was.
There was a lot of debate, as you know, Sean, right throughout the campaign about which polls could be trusted, national or state, and which polling companies were biased one way or the other, and the different models. Nate Silver kept getting talked about with his projections and so on. What did we learn from all of that about the reliability of polls and how we should treat them in the future?
Well, Nate had a great night, and hats off to him for that. I think at the end of the day, what we've learned is that all polling companies have their models that they try to use to keep up with the electorate. Some years they're going to be better than others. In 2008, the state polls and the national polls were spot on. In 2004, they were off a bit, and in 2008, they were off a point or two. But at the end of the day, they're the most accurate barometer we have of where an election stands.
The ultimate unknown, of course, with non-compulsory voting is who's actually going to vote come election day. Of the under 60% of people who could have voted who did vote, who were they? What did we learn about them from the exit polls, the demographics, those who actually took part in this thing?
Well, the first look at the exit poll showed that the white share of the electorate had dropped down to 71%, which would have been the lowest level ever, even lower than it was in 2008. But what's interesting is that the total turnout dropped as well. And what we're finding is that the number of minority voters in the states didn't increase that much. What happened is it looks like about 7 to 8 million white people who voted in 2008 who didn't show up this time. Why they didn't is a mystery that everyone's going to be poring over for the next few months.
There are a few other little surprises embedded in those exit polls. For instance, that young people who were supposedly going to be very flighty and have abandoned Barack Obama after the hope and change didn't work out from 4 years ago, they turned out in substantial numbers, in some cases greater numbers than they did 4 years ago.
Well, one of the interesting things about the demographics of the United States is you have a big bubble of population in the 65-year-old plus area, and you have kind of this dip, and then you have another big bubble coming with the younger generation, the millennial generation. And so as those voters begin to mature and grow older, there's more and more of them are going to pop up, and we're going to see the youth vote continue to grow in scope.
There seem to be sort of two camps at the moment on the Republican side, Sean. Those saying, "Hey, look, you know, the national vote, we came close within a couple of percent. This is no time for hand wringing or too much navel gazing." Others say the Republicans have got systemic demographic problems that mean with the high Hispanic vote that Democrats are getting, the African American vote, the Asian American vote, the GOP is the party of old white guys, and they're dying off, and so will the party. What do you think?
Well, I think there's something to be said for both of those in a way. I mean, it was a close election. I don't think there's any need to radically revamp the Republican Party any more than there was a need to radically revamp the Democratic Party after they had a narrow loss in 2004 and engaged in a lot of navel-gazing. At the same time, the demographics are what they are, and the GOP does need to figure out a better way to reach out to Latino voters and Asian voters and African American voters. Even if it's not just a question of the party surviving, it's something that you should should do in a broad, diverse country like this.
Within minutes of the result becoming known this week, it seems, Sean, that Conservatives were immediately saying what Conservatives often say after Republicans lose presidential elections: we nominated somebody who was too moderate. If we'd nominated a Conservative, we would have won. What do you think? If you'd nominated a more Conservative candidate, if there had been a viable but more Conservative candidate, could they have won?
Well, I think with a candidate who, like Ronald Reagan or even George W. Bush, who knew how to speak both to suburbanites and to downscale rural voters, they might have been able to convince those 7 million voters, white voters who dropped out, to show up. But at the same time, Mitt Romney was running on a very conservative platform. He wanted to privatize Medicare, which was far beyond anything Ronald Reagan ever proposed. I think Romney's problem was more that he was a flip-flop candidate than that he wasn't conservative enough in the end. No one knew who Mitt Romney was.
Sean, are you one of those who subscribes to the theory that, in fact, this result was largely preordained by the particular combination this year of economic factors, social factors, and the two candidates involved? Or could one of those apparently turning point moments, the first debate or maybe Sandy last week, have actually altered this result?
Yeah, I'm not a big kind of economic determinist. I think that the economy was improving slowly, and a lot of Republicans overlooked that fact, that was going to make it harder to defeat Barack Obama than they had expected. But at the same time, there were these turning point moments. The Republicans didn't have a particularly good convention. Mitt Romney had an awful September with his 47% comment. And the hurricane at the end, especially with Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, chiming in on Barack Obama's behalf, gave him a chance to look presidential and show leadership. So I do think those all had an effect on the outcome of the race.
Sean, we're going to be talking about partisanship a little bit more later in the program, but what's your view on the question of whether Barack Obama, from this result, has enough of a mandate to bend the congressional Republicans slightly to his will? Are we any closer to getting some sort of a consensus, some sort of bipartisan approach to the debt at this point?
I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. I mean, again, it was a 51-49 election. The Republicans did hold the House of Representatives, so all of those representatives have a mandate, just like Barack Obama does. At the same time, with the presidential election now, the next one 4 years down the road, hopefully the two sides can come together a little better than they have over the last couple years and get something done, because we have some really, really big problems in this country right now.
Now, before we move on, I'd like to revisit some of the issues you raised in that interview, John, because we learned a lot from the exit polls. Firstly, Sean mentioned how there was a record low white vote during this election. He said 71%, but I always trust Fox News polling, so I'm going to say 72% in the electorate. But that was only part of the changes. The youth vote went from 18% of the vote to 19% of the vote, surpassing the record that Obama set in 2008. Right. Unmarried voters went from 34% of the electorate to 41% of the electorate. That's a big jump. And about 46% of Obama's vote came from racial minorities. So that means possibly by 2016, definitely by 2020, the Democrats are looking at becoming a majority-minority party. I mean, have a look at this Latino vote on the laptop. This is the Democrat Latino vote. This is the Republican Latino vote. You can see they got quite close together under Bush. But now it's becoming more and more Democratic. They're into the 70s now. Now, Obama only won 39% of the white vote, and he still won the election easily. Things are changing in America fast. Some other interesting stats from the exit polls I found. After all the song and dance about female voters, Obama actually won a smaller proportion of the female vote this year than he did in 2008. And even though he won 67% of the single woman vote, that's also less than he did last time. Finally, two issues that really proved critical as far as I'm concerned. Firstly, on the question, who would you trust to handle an international crisis? The old foreign policy one. Obama won 42-37, and that is pretty much unheard of for a Democrat to do that in modern times. Secondly, 60% of voters said the economy was their top issue. So how the hell did Obama win that election with their economy? Here is how. 45% of the country said the condition of the nation's economy is not so good, as opposed to poor, but most of them said not so good. At least a plurality said not so good. Now have a look what happened. 55% of those people voted for Obama to Romney's 42%. Romney should have swept those people up. But Romney never sealed the deal. First of all, he never sealed the deal in convincing people that the economy was Obama's fault. Go to the laptop. Who's to blame for the current economic problems? Obama 38%, Bush 53%. And what's more, he couldn't convince people that he could do any better than Obama could to solve the economy. That is why he lost the election.
OK, so Mitt Romney lost the election, Barack Obama won the election, he's president for the next 4 years, but what has he won? Don't want to be too much of a downer here, but there is a very tough road ahead, not just for Barack Obama, but all members of Congress. This looming fiscal cliff, the automatic cuts to spending and the expiration of the so-called Bush-era tax cuts, they kick in at the end of December, unless a grand bargain can be reached. But what hope is there that the gridlock can be overcome in time to prevent another recession, this one of Washington's very own making? Norm Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute and Scott Faulkner, former Chief Administrative Officer of the US House of Representatives, joined us a little earlier from Washington, D.C. Norm Ornstein, first to you, just how divided has government in Washington been for the last couple of years? We've heard a lot of talk about gridlock, but how bad is it?
It's the worst I've seen in 43 years of being immersed in this process. I have a book with my friend Tom Mann called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and it never looks good. But, you know, the divisions go beyond a partisan and ideological polarization. It's certainly there in stark terms. It's becoming almost tribal, and that's the real problem that we have. Tribal means when you say, if you're for it, I'm against it, even if I was for it yesterday. And we're getting to that point where many of the ideological divisions are bridgeable. You can find common ground on debt reduction, on the fiscal cliff, even on health policy, but not if the positions are based on which tribe is supporting them.
When you're talking about tribalism, one of the aspects, one of the problems we have at the moment is that there doesn't even appear to be accountability for the tribalism. Like, you look at the House in the election just now, the Democrats won by at least 500,000 votes, and the Republicans have a 40-seat majority because essentially it seems gerrymandering. Is that analysis correct? Is it largely gerrymandering, and what do you do about that?
Certainly, a significant part of it is gerrymandering, and what you see is that in a state like North Carolina, for example, the Democrats across the state actually captured significantly more votes for Congress than Republicans did, but Republicans ended up with 9 out of the 12 seats. So you've got safe seats, and that means that people don't feel that they have to respond to any larger national mandate. That's a significant part of it. But frankly, it goes beyond the redistricting. The tribalism hit the Senate. It's affected the primaries there, kind of pulls the parties apart. And if you talk about accountability, really the difficulty is we have parliamentary parties now, but we don't have a system like the Australian where you have accountability to a majority party. Voters are trying to figure out who to blame. And so after all this anger and disappointment with dysfunctional politics and a lousy economy, we end up right where we started with the status quo.
Scott Faulkner, you were there in the 1990s at the height of the Gingrich revolution, at a time of a very, very partisan environment, had government shutdowns, but also there was an accommodation. Certainly in Bill Clinton's second term, budgets got passed and the sides were able to come together. What was the key? What are the lessons?
Well, I think the key is first of all, you had a president who, you might remember the term triangulation, that Clinton realized there was a third way, and so after he got defeated basically in '94 with the big Republican Revolution vote, he realized that the triangulation was the only way to go. Also, the Republicans realized after they got whipsawed with the government shutdown in the fall of '95 that the American public really did not like to have this kind of sandbox type infighting going on, and so both sides realized that they had to rise above their partisan divide to govern, and they did, and it was very successful for a number of years. The problem you have nowadays is that the coming class, or actually the coming Congress coming in, the 113th Congress, is the lowest experienced Congress since 1935. Over a third of the members of this Congress will have served 3 years or less. So you don't have people with institutional memory or institutional loyalties.
What does that mean? Does that mean that they're going to be more swayed by lobbyists or more easily led by their party leaders, that this now comes down to the senior members to show them the way to bipartisanship?
Well, I guess the key is they're going to be looking at who put them in office. So in the case of Republicans, they're still looking at the Tea Party, and they're looking at themselves as being renegades. And the Democrats are still saying, well, Obama got back in, and let's stick to our guns with those policies. So the issue on both sides is neither side got anything close to a reality check about governing. That both sides played to their base. Both sides ended up basically where they started 2 years ago, and so no lessons learned, which means no progress going forward.
Scott, do you think there will be any lessons learned at all from, say, the last election just now, where take situation with Indiana and Missouri, where Romney won 54% of the vote in both states, yet Murdoch in Indiana got 44% and Aiken in Missouri got 39%. We're talking 15 points below Romney in exactly the same state because they were so extreme. Do you think anyone's going to take stock from that and go, okay, this is the theoretical limit to how extreme we can be, or do you think they're just going to ignore it?
Well, I think the key is as you said, theological, that the theocrats in both states came to grief, and I think Republicans, at least again, hopefully the adult Republicans, will realize that we're in the 21st century, not the 10th century, and will hopefully put some of those thoughts aside. The problem is that at the state legislative level, Republicans have been pushing personhood and other bills that led people to talking about a war on women. And so hopefully at the national level, the National Party will realize again that these 10th century ideas should stay in the 10th century.
Norm Ornstein, it seems on the face of it that the next Senate is going to be potentially more partisan than the last. Bipartisan senators like Richard Lugar are gone. Moderates, Scott Brown in Massachusetts on the Republican side, is gone. It seems the aisle just got wider. Nobody can quite reach across. Is there a way around that? Is partisanship based on the need for moderates on both sides, or is there another way to reach an accommodation?
The Senate, I actually think, has some real potential for moving in a different direction. I've talked to a number of Republicans who joined in with the kind of parliamentary effort to vote against everything and filibuster virtually every bill that came along to stretch it out and make it more difficult. They're not comfortable with that. People like Lamar Alexander of Tennessee and Bob Corker of Tennessee, the people who are the Gang of Six working on a budget deal, they all came to solve problems, not just to support the tribe and vote no on everything. So we have 40 senators, 20 from each party, working on some kind of a deal to try and avert the fiscal cliff. The Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, may not be one of them, and his comments after the election were anything but conciliatory, but I don't think he will or could block it. The real problem, though, is still in the House of Representatives. And, Scott was talking about what lessons were learned by some of these members. A very large share of the freshmen, especially from last time, the so-called Tea Party freshmen, faced challenges from the right in primaries. Even though they came in from the edge of the spectrum, they were criticized because they had gone Washington and voted for something. So they won. Redistricting helped them win. But the lesson that they've learned is put your head up out of the foxhole and vote for something, and that could include a budget deal that includes a tax increase, and you may be toast because you're going to be knocked off in a primary. And that makes the task of the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and trying to find a deal where he would probably lose a majority of his own Republicans who signed this Grover Norquist tax pledge, no taxes, a very, very great challenge. So I'm more worried about the House in this way than I am about the Senate.
Scott, when we're talking about the fiscal cliff, I saw a stat that we're talking about 5.1% of GDP that could get crunched if they fall off the fiscal cliff, which would basically be similar to an austerity measure from Greece in 2009. You're talking Greece-like situation here. Is it that bad?
The problem with the fiscal cliff, it was totally man-made. I mean, the key is that last summer, actually summer of 2011, the Republicans decided to take what is usually an administrative act, basically a bookkeeping act, which is the debt ceiling, which is a trailing activity, and they tried to make it a leading activity, saying that if you stop the borrowing at some point, then you're forcing budget cuts and budget policy. So they turned the thing on its head, especially at a point where they had already created a budget that was going to go above the debt ceiling anyway. So they basically didn't want to take the consequences for their own actions, and now we're paying the price for it. What's crazy about all this is that even the budget itself is a management exercise, not a political exercise, but everyone's made it a political exercise, and everyone's down the rabbit hole. And I don't know if they're ever going to get out.
President Obama, re-elected, he's at the start of his second term. Surely his powers are never higher than now. Does he have an active role to play in the next couple of months to get Congress to an agreement on the so-called fiscal cliff?
He has some momentum coming out of an election that he won handily in electoral vote terms and a clear popular vote majority. But I think, the role he's going to play is not to come out with his own detailed plan, but to try, much of it working behind the scenes, to get the Senate to reach this deal, which is going to be more of a template along the lines of that Simpson-Bowles commission, and then get Foursquare behind it as soon as it emerges, and work with Simpson and Bowles, who he has a good relationship with both, with Republicans like Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, with whom he has a personal friendship, and with some of these business leaders who are working on it, get that supermajority vote in the Senate, and then try and go public with a very aggressive move to force the House to act.
And Scott, is that how you see it playing out?
Neither side is going to want to do anything substantive, and certainly nothing that's going to disrupt their base. So they're going to find something superficial. Both sides assume they can still kick the can down the road because they both think there's still road to kick the can down. And I don't know if that really is the case. So we could still be in for some major problems as we move into the new year.
Well, Scott Faulkner, thank you very much for joining us. Norm Ornstein, to you as well. Thank you both. And joining us this week at the roundish table, the former deputy editor of Newsweek magazine, Julia Baird, and former BBC Washington correspondent, Nick Bryant. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
It's good to be back.
Julia, at the end of what has been a momentous week in the United States, ultimately, do you think this election was decided on particular issues, or was this down to electoral engineering, Barack Obama's campaign machine that just managed to eke out a win?
Yes and yes.
Right.
And the performances of the candidates as well. But I think really, at its heart, this is about what kind of America this is and what kind of democracy this is. I was really reminded that in Obama's speech. Is it the democracy, are we ruling for 47%? Are we ruling for 53%? Are we recognising the fact that last year white births were for the first time ever in the minority? Was it inclusive? Is this a diverse nation? Or is this the nation that, that Bill O'Reilly is mourning on television and saying it's the end of the white man? It was almost like the cowboy into the sunset, this kind of sad hand-wringing, on Fox News by the likes of those commentators. I think there were many, many things that decided the election, but every single American election is about what is America and what are we proud of.
Nick, was this the victory of the real modern America over some sort of archaic image of some 50s utopia?
The modern family America, as it's been described, against the Mad Men America. Not a great analogy, because in Mad Men America, the Republicans were a moderate party.
Right.
In fact, one of the characters, was
Right.
Betty Draper's husband
That's right.
works for Nelson Rockefeller,
Right,
who was a
right.
great liberal Republican.
We've
Clearly,
almost forgotten about them.
exactly,
By the way.
yeah, precisely. I mean, those were the days when a moderate Republican wasn't oxymoronic.
And that's what Mitt Romney was before he changed his mind so many times.
Precisely, and that's why he did a pretty good job up in Massachusetts.
Right.
Clearly, they've got a demography problem at the moment. When they had a virtual lock on the White House between 1968 and 1988, they won 5 out of 6. They probably would have won in 76 had it not been for Watergate. They pursue what was called the Southern strategy. It was all based on disgruntled whites. Now they need to ditch the Southern strategy entirely, and they need a Colorado strategy. They need a Nevada strategy. These states where the Hispanic vote has become such a big factor. A Florida strategy as well, because the Hispanic vote helped Obama win there. And there's an electoral college problem as well for them. The electoral college is going to be the same in 2016 and in 20. And for the Republicans to win in the electoral college now, it's weighted so heavily in favour of the Democrats. They need to win the popular vote by +3. Now, they haven't done that since 1988 when George Herbert Walker Bush won. So there are real structural problems to the Republican Party.
Just to put that in context, what you're saying there, in Nevada and in Florida, there were 3% more of the voters were Hispanics just between this election and the last.
Right.
The vote is increasing enormously in those states.
Nevada, the
Most
census
Latinos.
showed between 2000 and 2010, the population of Hispanics in Nevada went up 80%. Nevada was a reliably Republican state in the 1970s and 1980s. Clinton won it, Barack Obama won it last time. But that used to be a Republican state, and now it's trending very heavily towards the Democrats because of the Hispanic factor.
And but the GOP, I think, also needs to wrestle with the idea of not just attracting the Hispanic vote, but not actively repelling it by not saying we're going to make life so miserable for you, you're going to self-deport. You know, and it's the same thing with women as well. Like, why continue to fight for control of women's bodies when clearly it's not working for them?
Definitely want to talk about the women's bodies, but just before we get onto that, I was just going to say with the Hispanic thing, the point you're making about not repelling,
Yes.
Obama, when he thought he was off the record earlier in the election campaign to a newspaper, said that he said if I'm going to win, it's going to be on the back of the Hispanic vote, and he ended up winning 71-27 on the Hispanic vote.
Right.
And he said, so what's going to happen? His prediction was the Republicans are going to know that they need to fix the Hispanic situation as far as their vote goes, and they're going to try and pass immigration reform as a result of that. Do you think his analysis was correct? Do you think they're going to try to?
It's a real litmus test of the Republicans. It's a real test. If they want to stay in the game and get on the right side of demography, they're on the wrong side of demography right now, then immigration reform is the way to do it. And in the past 24 hours, you've seen people like Sean Hannity on Fox News suddenly revise his position on immigration. You've got a senior right-wing commentator like Charles Krauthammer at the Washington Post also saying we need to get immigration reform sorted. If they're this needs to be an outreach party. They can't be a status
But
quo
it's only 8
party
years
anymore.
ago that George W. Bush got 44% of the Latino vote, which is it's not a majority, but still it kept him in the game. It won him re-election, being able to hold up his end. So these things aren't necessarily set in stone.
Let me tell you why that happened. The reason why is because when you look at the polling, only 31% of Latinos said they'd be more likely to vote for Republicans if they support the DREAM Act, which is part of immigration reform. The majority of Latinos actually support the Democrats, not because of immigration reasons in the polls, but because they're actually big government. They're a big government populace. They believe in a big government. And George Bush was a big government conservative. He was compassionate conservative. So
George W. Bush got it. I mean, remember
repelling Latinos for economic reasons.
He spoke a bit of Spanish, if you remember, George W. Bush. And he also wanted immigration reform. He was proposing it, and it was the right-wing Republicans that stopped him doing it. So he kind of understood the new demography, and so did his brother, crucially. I mean, Jeb Bush remained viable and was such a succcul governor of Florida.
Still viable, perhaps.
Well, many people would argue that he is the guy that can get him back in the game because he understands the new America, and he proved in Florida he could kind of build that coalition that wins a key state like that.
What about the women's vote, though?
Yeah,
as a key demographic, I mean, surely if you're giving up more than half of the population, you're in trouble at the outset.
Well, absolutely. You think it's like, that's right, it's pure maths. And there's been a big argument about arithmetic, which would please you enormously throughout this campaign. It's been staggering. And how even to the very last, people were saying, I don't believe those numbers, they can't possibly add up. So yes, on the basic maths, you can't really ignore the women. And I think now that there's such demonstrable proof that it's working against them, that you can't talk down to women. You can't say there's such a thing as legitimate rape. You cannot kind of patronise them. You cannot dismiss such concepts as equal pay. And also, of course, it's about the command of the economy. That's always the number one thing historically driving the women's vote. So let's not, rule that out of the equation.
The fact that Murdoch and Aiken got so smashed by their comments about rape, does that mean that do you think Republicans are going to learn from that?
I actually think that's a cultural shift.
Yeah.
I mean, this is part of the
huge.
GOP platform about anti-abortion. It destroyed them, and they were extremely embarrassed by it. And yet, they were speaking their minds. It wasn't a gaffe. It was, a truth, a belief of theirs. So I think that's a shift. I was really surprised at how much that had worked against them and how much that actually tainted the party and the party's views of women and all the things that women are grappling with. That's just not one thing. You don't really want to have to go to your employer and ask for permission to, get contraception. It's quite inconceivable in 2012 that could still be on the cards, but it was debated.
I was going to say another stat. I've got too many today. From the exit polling, 59 to 36% of voters said that they believe abortion should be generally legal, and out of that 59%, 67 to 31 supported Obama. So that's a Democrat issue now.
Right. Yeah. It's just very ugly when it's politicized. Yeah. I'm very glad that it's not generally in Australia. I think it's much. It's a private concern, and it shouldn't be used and abused. And we see how ugly it can get.
The Republicans are clearly on the wrong side of that issue electorally. The problem for the Republicans in shifting towards the centre is obviously a radicalised part of the party is now strongly evangelical, and for them this is an article of faith. They won't budge on it. So that's why the civil war that will unfold over the next few years could get so angry.
So
because these are ideological people, and they are very faith-based people, and as I say, for them this is doctrinal. It's an article of faith. It's not about politics.
All right. Well, Nick Bryant, former BBC Washington correspondent, Julia Baird, former Newsweek deputy editor. Thank you both for joining us on the Roundish Table this week. And that is all the time we have for this special US presidential election week edition of Planet America. Next time round, we will ask, what can Barack Obama learn from Franklin Roosevelt's troubled second term?
I have no doubt Obama will be watching for tips. But for now, we will leave you with Mitt Romney's post-loss song. I cannot believe the TV networks missed this. See ya.
Bye now.
Still rich, filthy rich. Trust me, my strategy worked perfectly. Didn't have one single glitch. Shucks, I can go overseas and invest in whatever I darn well please. While Obama triple-double checks his pension to make sure it isn't overly Chinese. Life's a flippin' bitch. Wait, except it ain't for me, 'cause I'm still horse riding, company acquiring, income hiding, employee firing, luxury yacht buying, rich.
Thanks, guys.